The views, comments, and opinions of the following program do not necessarily reflect those of Morris Media Studios, morrismedialive.com, or its affiliates. Listener discretion is advised.
Good day, sisters and brothers. So good to have you with us. Welcome to Faith Without Borders. I'm your host, Pastor Kelvin Sauls. So glad you could join us this day as we will be tackling a very difficult yet, I believe, very important conversation as we make our way through this holiday weekend. We want to salute, all those who've served and who've sacrificed. We thank you for your service. But I always believe that we can honor and celebrate those who served any day, and we should do it as often, as possible. Today, I've decided to focus on a very important event that took place around 100 years ago, right here in the United States of America. It took place over 2 days, May the 31st through June the 1st in 1921. We're going to be talking about, commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, and we're going to be connecting around it by way of recognition, reconstruction, and reparations. I believe that it is so important that we come together to face the truth about history in the United States, but especially, the history and the legacy of white religious nationalism, as well as domestic terrorism against blacks here in the United States, and to see how that can provide for us a path forward to see how we can be about strategic, solutions forward towards a more perfect union. We cannot get to that union, or that union will never be perfect, not unless we engage in truth-telling. Now, I know everybody wants to be quick to talk about reconciliation, but I think it's very important for us to realize that without, a racial equity, there cannot be, adequate or authentic racial reconciliation, not in this country, nor in the land of my birth, South Africa. And that's what I'm bringing to this conversation, because when I was introduced, to this, through undergrad and grad school here in the United States, I have never, heard about the Tulsa Race Massacre until, I arrived here in Los Angeles, pastoring at the Homer United Methodist Church. And there, Robert Lewis, a friend of mine here in Los Angeles, invited me or introduced me, to a concept around, economic equity, here for African Americans, and that led to the start of an organization that I'm glad to serve on the board of. The BCIF is what we call it, and that is the Black, coalition fund that seek to uplift and support Black businesses from start to thriving, and so glad to be part of, that movement. But let me just start off by describing, what happened that day, just as I've done a little, research. 1:30 a.m., May the 31st, 1921. Terror descended on the Greenwood community of Tulsa, Oklahoma. In less than 18 hours, 10,000 people became homeless. In less than 18 hours, 1,256 homes were destroyed. In less than 18 hours, for the first time in American history, bombs were dropped, on an American community and on Americans. In less than 18 hours, 300 people were killed and were moved into mass graves. Some of those who survived were moved into internment camps. In less than 18 hours, 600 businesses were destroyed and over 200 churches were destroyed, if not badly damaged. That took place in less than 18 hours between May the 31st through June the 1st, 1921. I wasn't there. I'm reading statistics. We want to start by listening to Mother Fletcher, 106 years old. She was only 6 years old that day. 2 weeks ago, she testified, on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., about that and the ongoing fight for repair, for recognition, the ongoing fight for restitution for her family, and all those affected by the Tulsa Race Massacre. Let's listen to her testimony.
First witness is Miss Viola Fletcher, also known, if I can, Mother Fletcher. Thank you. I don't have a mother, so thank you. Mother Fletcher is the oldest living survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. She was 7 years old when she lived through the massacre. Mother Fletcher, you are now recognized to testify. Is the microphone on?
Yes. My name is that okay. My name is Viola Ford Fletcher. I'm the daughter of Lucinda Ellis and John Wesley Ford of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm the sister of Hughes Van Ellis, who is also here today. I'm a survivor of the Tulsa Race Massacre. 2 weeks ago, I celebrated my 107th birthday. Today, I'm visiting Washington, D.C. for the first time in my life. I'm here seeking justice, and I'm asking my country to acknowledge what happened in Tulsa in 1921. On May 31st and 21, I went to bed in my family's home in Greenwood. Neighbors of Tulsa, the neighborhood I felt asleep in that night, was rich, not just in terms of wealth, but in culture, community, heritage, and my family had a beautiful home. We had great neighbors, and I had friends to play with. I felt safe. I had everything a child could need. I had a bright future ahead of me. Greenwood could, Still, Greenwood should have given me the chance to truly make it in this country. Within a few hours, all of that was gone. The night of the massacre, I was awakened by my family. My parents and 5 siblings were there. I was told we had to leave, and that was it. I will never forget the violence of the white mob when we left our home. I still see black men being shot, black bodies lying in the street. I still smell smoke and see fire. I still see black businesses being burned. I still hear airplanes flying overhead. I hear the screams. I have lived through the massacre every day. Our country may forget this history, but I cannot. I will not, and other survivors do not, and our descendants do not. When my family was forced to leave Tulsa, I lost my chance of an education. I never finished school past the 4th grade. I have never made much money in my country. State and city took a lot from me. Despite this, I spent time supporting the war effort in the shipyards of California, but most of my life I was a domestic worker serving white families. I never made much money, but to this day I can barely afford my everyday needs. All the while the city of this Tulsa have unjustly used the names and stories of victims like me to enrich myself and its white allies through the 30s million raised by the Tulsa Centennial Commissioner while I was continued to live in poverty. I am a 107-year-old and have never seen justice. I pray that one day I will. I have been blessed with a long life and have seen the best and the worst of this country. I think about the horror inflicted upon black people in this country every day. This subcontinued committee has the power to lead us down a better path. I'm asking that my country acknowledge what has been happened to me, the traumas and the pain, the loss, and I ask survivors and descendants to be given the chance to seek justice, open the door. All of you know how easy it is to deny that a violent mob threatened your lives and took your property. For 70 years, the city of Tulsa and its Chamber of Commerce told us that the massacre didn't happen, like we didn't see it with our own eyes. You have me here right now. You see Mother Randall, you see my brother, Hughes Van Ellis. We live this history, and we can't ignore it. It's our lives with us. Oh, my goodness. We lost everything that day, our homes, our churches, our newspapers, our theaters, our lives. Greenwood represented all the best of what was possible for black people in America and for all the people. No one cared about us for almost 100 years. We and our history have been forgotten, washed away. This Congress must recognize us and our history. For black America, for the white Americans, and for all Americans, that's some justice. I guess was that it. Thank you.
Do you want to say anything else?
I thought it was another page.
Do you want to say anything else?
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else you want to say?
No, it's not.
Thank you very much. We appreciate very much your testimony.
Well, there you have it. I'm glad today to be joined by 3 individuals that I have the pleasure of working with around issues of racial justice. Glad to have with me today Mitchell Little. He's the executive director in the mayor's office of the city of Philadelphia, in the community and empowerment office, where he, actively, looks for strategies, to fight the drivers of disparity in the city of Philadelphia. And so glad, Mitch, to have you here with me. And also, Mitch and I, we share the distinct pleasure of having experienced the Atlantic Fellowship for Racial Equity together. That's how we met, and really appreciated all of Mitch's insights and his passion, for racial justice. Mitch, welcome. It's good to see you and have you.
Thank you, brother. Good to be here. Good to join the other guest here. Just excited to have a very important conversation and continue to lift up sort of our story in this country, and combat the erasure that continues to happen of the experiences of our people, our communities, in this land. So really grateful for being here today.
Yes. Also, straight up right here in Los Angeles, Jan Robinson Flint is the executive director of Black Women for Wellness, doing extraordinary work in the area of reproductive justice. Glad to be a part of that, family on the forefront, of racial justice. Jan, it's good to have you. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Reverend Sauls. It's good to be here and to join your esteemed panel this morning. I thought it was interesting that you brought someone in from Philly, Mitch Little. It's good to meet you, because Philly is the other, or one of the other cities that has been bombed by Americans in terms of Black folks when they bombed Move.
Yes.
And that was during our lifetime. So good morning. Lots to talk about.
Yeah, so we're going to get into it. Finally, Pastor William Smart, who's the president and CEO of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference of Southern California. He is my brother and comrade right here. And I know we have a busy couple of days coming up as we engage in local events around commemorating, the 100th, anniversary of, this massacre. Pastor Smart, I'm going to start with you as you greet us. When did you first hear about, the Tulsa Race Massacre, and what does it conjure up in you, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, around, the importance of recognizing what happened 100 years ago?
Yes. Thank you, Pastor Sauls, for allowing me to be on this esteemed program with these giants in their various capacities to liberate our people. And always, this show is on the cutting edge, and I so much appreciate that. Believe it or not, it was I heard about the Tulsa kind of late. I mean, I hate to put my newly found friend, Brother Little, on the spot, but it was really the Move massacre when they dropped the bomb that someone began to talk. I think at the time there was a national publication out called the Urban Leader newspaper, and it was on and when it talked about Wilson Good allowing that to take place, I think at the time, and said that this wasn't the first time, and it named some cities, and one of them was Rosewood, one of them was Elaine, Arkansas, and others, but Tulsa, it said, was the greatest, the most damaging time when something like this has happened, when there was a race riot and they dropped bombs. They flew private planes over, dropping bombs in the Greenwood section of Tulsa. And so it really conjured up then, and it continuously conjures up in me, Pastor Sauls and panel, anger that white supremacy has always and consistently destroyed Black African Americans' lives and property, and that there was such jealousy over the burgeoning community of Greenwood in Tulsa that there was always some jealousy, and it was like They were just waiting for the right opportunity to destroy. And it was a senseless act. It didn't have to take place, but they did it because of their racism and their prejudice and their hatred toward African Americans. And so it conjures that up because we see it still happening today.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that act of state-sanctioned violence, Jan, is one that I mean, it just went silent, right? That act of domestic terrorism just went silent. In terms of just the deception, that took place around trying to bury what happened, that particular day, and the recognition, of this. But for me, recognition, can be just recognition, but it can be recognition in terms of just the narrative, and the spin that America put on its history, and it always seems like it's the familiar, a pattern of victimize and then blame the victim, in terms of that. Your thoughts, Jan, around your feelings, around what happened, and just some thoughts, around how do we recognize what happened that day, but also recognize the narrative, of what happened and moving forward.
So first, a little bit of history about me and how it fits into this whole scheme of things. So I was born and raised in Chicago, and one of my very first memories was tanks rolling down the streets of Chicago. And this was when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and our city erupted and started burning. And they absolutely sent in the National Guard, and they absolutely sent in military to quell the violence in Chicago. So they had tanks rolling down the street. So that's one of my first memories of being born and raised in this country. So I have always been witness to the violence of the United States of America. It's not a new thing, but it is something that they continuously try to sweep under the rug, per se, but it's not going away. And it has been amplifying in this past, I want to say 10 years, right? With the election of Barack Obama, a lot of the white terrorists and white nationalism, I feel like it gave them a signal that they needed to up the terrorism, up the violence, and in this country. And that is primarily focused against Black people, primarily focused against us. So when I can't remember when I learned about Tulsa or Greenwood or Move, or I can't remember the first time that I have witnessed Black bodies being killed by state violence, because it feels like it has always been a part of the story in this country. It has always been a part of this story from my lifetime. I do know that as Black folks in this country, we have to amplify our history. We have to tell our history. We have to begin to celebrate our own holidays. We have to celebrate our own heroines. And we have to do that with our community and then with other communities. And that's one way of how we begin to recognize the story of this country, right? And how we begin to let everyone recognize the story of this country. Today is Sunday, and it makes me think that part of what we need to do is recognize, or not recognize, but call the names of our ancestors and call the spirit of our ancestors, and ask them to rest in power, and ask them to be the sturdy shoulders that we stand on, and ask them to give us strength to move ourselves in a different direction, because I do think that we are at a pivotal point right now in terms of which way are we going to go. Are we going to continue this escalation and level of violence? Or are we going to have some reparation, reconciliation, acknowledgement, and amends for the violence that this country is absolutely seeped in?
Yeah, absolutely. Mitch, being from Philadelphia and knowing the history there, and that's why I was so glad when were available, because I wanted to make that connection, with somebody from a city, where a similar, tragedy happened, but also one who, in the work that you're doing, right now around, seeking to disrupt those drivers of disparity, the connection, between, economic segregation and just this, ongoing, paralysis that our folks seem to experience. Here we had a community that pulled themselves up, at their bootstraps, and yet that wasn't even enough around that. Your thoughts on when you heard about this, and just what it conjures up, in you, mentally, emotionally, spiritually.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. And it's interesting that folks have made MOVE a part of this conversation. So I think I first heard about Tulsa in undergrad. Um, Really, the first time a Philly kid had been at Penn State University in the middle of rural Pennsylvania. They say that there's Pittsburgh and there's Philadelphia and Kentucky or Mississippi or any other place that you want to put in between those two states on each, those two cities on each side of the state. Rural Pennsylvania is not unlike the South in a lot of ways, and in fact, when you saw the sort of numbers of domestic terrorists and segregationists rise in the states, certainly Pennsylvania was top on that list. And so it was a part of me sort of trying to develop a language around uplifting our stories and our history, challenging the status quo, and trying to connect the historical and racial and economic dots, which I understood a kid from, West Philadelphia knew that things weren't fair, that opportunities weren't even, and that the game was fixed. And I didn't have at that time, I didn't have a language to sort of share my thinking around that. Listening to Mother Fletcher, though, reminded me of Carrie Bell Smith, who was my great aunt, who raised me, who came up through the Great Migration to Philadelphia. And looking at Mother Fletcher, saw the dignity, the composure, the tenacity of a generation gone by, right? A woman, 107 years old, came with her siblings to speak, right? Of all the things that this woman could be doing in the latter years of her life, knew that she had to respond. If given a chance, she had to speak up, and she had to fight back in her voice, in her own way. And this erasure happens not only systemically and institutionally, but it also happens within our community. To disinvest in that history and that culture and our stories, and trying to adopt and assimilate into a country, into a culture that will never, ever accept us unless there is a seismic change in power and influence and resource. And I also thought about the fear, quite frankly, of the oppressor existing in many different ways. Not too many years back, there was a poster on Facebook of night patrols that were being organized in Delaware. And I thought it was fake. And I called it. And, I put on a little voice. Hi, this is Jim Bob, and saw your poster, thinking about our communities and wanting to take part in protecting what's ours. And want to know if you were a brother of like mind, continue to stand up to protect the purity of our community. And the voice back.
A lot of keywords.
And intentionally so, right? And the voice back said, "Brother, you have contacted the right number." And to validate that poster was real in Delaware, just north of the Mason-Dixon line, sent a shock of fear through me that has existed probably generation untapped, but in my DNA, and made very clear the relationship of oppression and terrorism in this country in that quick phone call. And even though I knew we were on the phone and he couldn't hurt me, but to understand how close it was and how real it was and has been to our people generation after generation. That's what I saw and heard in Mother Fletcher's testimony.
Yeah. I mean, this whole piece about fear that you're talking about, just the fear of the other and how, in this culture, we have been othered. And so, I come at this conversation, as a Black immigrant from South Africa, where a lot of this has gone on, swept under the rug. And now there's just this whole, thing about as there needs to be a reconstruction of what needs to take place. Yes, it has to be, by way of policy. We're talking about, the reconstruction even, of policing because of that connection around, the state-sanctioned violence then and state-sanctioned violence today, and how George Zimmerman probably saw himself as part of a night patrol. All right, hence the death of Trayvon Martin, starting off, Black Lives Matter as a continuation, just of, Black folk just, asking the question, when will we be enough, in terms of just striving to be, and become whatever, we understand ourselves needing to become, to be accepted here. How can, this reconstruction take place in such a way that humanity is restored, dignity, is restored, by way of systems, that we fight on an everyday basis still today around that. So Jan, just that fear is still there, that othering is still there, and the narrative of shame that's been pushed, on us, even about what happened, in Tulsa, talk to us about just how, how do we just, continue this reconstruction, because it's taken place, given the bold and broad shoulders we're standing on. Your thoughts on that?
I think one of the things that you said, and I wrote down like a note, and I said, we are enough. This is not about us. It's not about Black people. Mm-hmm. It's about them, right? Mm-hmm. It is about their violence and their violent tendencies, and how do they change? And I actually don't think it is our responsibility to change them. They need to do that for themselves. I think about, what do we do? And what we do is we continue to tell our story, and we continue to tell our history. We continue to tell it both from the perspective of the accomplishments and the heroes, as well as the atrocities that have happened. One of the things that I continuously tell my staff at Black Women for Wellness is that we can't expect the oppressor to to educate us. We have got to do our own education, right? We have got to make sure that it is not exclusive, right? That it is not only for those of us who could afford to go to college, but it is that we make sure that we share our story and get the story from our community at large, right? From when I listened to Mother Fletcher, she said that this was the first time she had been to Washington, D.C., right? And that her education and was fourth grade education. Now, I'm going to say she sounded strong, right? Her voice was strong and her presence was strong. And that this was the first time she had been to DC, and that where her, her formal education ended, because I am sure that she had plenty of, quote, informal education, is another symptom of what we can do, or a signal of what we can do among Black people, right? We can make sure we're educated, whether it's formal education or informal education. And when I say that education, I'm not talking about the oppressor's education. I'm not talking about, celebrating Columbus Day and the 4th of July, but looking at, on May 19th, we had a celebration of Malcolm X, El Haj Malik El Shabazz, because that's his birthday, to talk about what his accomplishments were and what his contribution is to our community. So for us to make sure that our community knows and acknowledges and celebrates our history. And I think travel is imperative also, not only simply to DC, but one of the things that happens is that when you get out from under the veil or the threat or the oppression of this country, when you get out of the country, you get to see, whoa, wait a minute, there's a whole world of Black people, and they are doing things. They are running countries. They are flying airplanes. They are doing all the things that Black people do, that if you listen to the propaganda that is constantly put on us, that you don't realize is possible even. So just getting out from under that oppressive environment of this country is important and is critical, as well as gathering our story, telling our story, and educating our people. So I think, yes, policy is important. We do policy all the time. But some of that root work is absolutely needed at this point.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned a word that I just, in so many ways use a lot, which is roots. We've got to water those roots. You can only fly as high as you are rooted deeply. We all want to talk about people needing to get wings, right? But if you are not rooted deeply, it gives people ways to clip your wings. So you can only think of flying so high, right? And you're right, Jen, education plays a huge role in this. And I wanted to bring Pastor Smart in on this, around education. We all know the book, The Miseducation, that came out, some time ago. But the fact that this was just, eliminated out of history, not just in the United States, right, but in Tulsa, in the school, the history books, of Tulsa, just how miseducation, continues, around that, and truthful miseducation. It begs the question of how in this country, we've chosen to do history, or the government or those who are in charge of education, how they've chosen to do history, right? And how we do history in this country continues to contribute, to justifying, the drivers of disparity, right? Of the justified state-sanctioned violence, around that. So Pastor Smart, we see this, in terms of what's happening with Nicole Hannah Jones, and the 1619 Project. I mean, that became a huge issue, for 45 to try and get rid of, and that continues, in so many ways. So, folk talk about cancel culture, but I mean, Black history has been canceled out of the history of America, since its inception around that. So let's, I mean, Pastor Smart, just the education that needs to take place around this is just astronomical, not just education, in school, but I mean, let alone education in churches around, all of this in terms of it. How can that reconstruction take place, educationally, politically, as we move forward on this?
I'm gonna, in a minute, I'm gonna say something that I haven't said before. But first of all, if you go back to Mother Fletcher, you see how her how she was stifled. She was in the 4th grade and she was leading a good life. Many young people in Tulsa were doing that. Many young people around the world, African Americans around this country, and people come and they stifle their education. They have put us in poor schools, and they have put us in disintegrating educational systems. They have not empowered us with the same tools that our white counterparts have gotten throughout the years. So there's been a deliberate strategy to attempt to debase us by not educating us. But so many people, in the worst of conditions, African Americans have rised up and gotten the education. It could be formal education, it could be informal education, but they have educated themselves as Sister Fletcher has done and has overcome that stronghold that white supremacy has placed on us. Number one. Number two, to answer your question as right now and what can be done, we have to take over education systems. Black people and brown people have to run for school boards and come in there with the type of strategy and the type of that is inculcated into them that they're going to fix, and they're going to do their best to make sure that the right policies are enacted. Number three, we have to demand, I agree that policy change is not always the answer, but policy change is important. We have to change the policies in America and in places like Tulsa. We have to change the policy. And then fourthly, there has to be some incentive to white folks who commit these crimes. We need to go back to the church. We need to go back to the words of the church that your behind is going to hell for the way that you treat people. The fourth thing, you're going to hell. There's a whole lot of people right now in hell because of the way, and they're living, and I hope their souls can remain damned for the way that they have hurt the marginalized, the victimized, the disenfranchised, the poor. I mean, you have run roughshod over people, and there are consequences. In my religion, there's consequences for that. Your soul will be cast in hell for doing that. So yes, that's part of what I have to say about it, Pastor Sauls.
Yes, and I mean, when you talk about, that hell has to be invoked, it really brings up the whole piece around accountability. And there has been just a great sense of disparity when it comes to accountability, right? It just seems as if some folk just don't get held accountable, and so folk, who are ignorant, about what happened in the past, continue to be arrogant, about, what's going on now when people are being called to account for what happened in the past. So you have this fusion of ignorance and arrogance that in so many ways, facilitates then, indifference, and so the the disparity continues. It gets ignored, and that's really what happened in so many ways economically. In Tulsa and with the Greenwood community in terms of dividing Tulsa into North Tulsa, where the black folk live, and South Tulsa, where the white folk lived. And truth be told, Mitch, economics play a big role in this, right? Because of the sheer loss of a generational wealth, right, that took place in Greenwood, and to add insult to injury, what happened right after that in terms of the mass graves, the internment camps, etc., etc. But then constructing that freeway, right, insult to injury, through those sacred, grounds, and now, of course, the University of Oklahoma, is there. So it was really just pillage, and then the taking over of, property. That's not new in American history, right? I mean, that has happened since 1619. But the economic consequences around this, Mitch, continues. I mean, that's the legacy of this tragedy, around that. I mean, as you work around, what needs to happen in Philadelphia, let alone around so many communities, including here in Los Angeles. I mean, yeah, policy has its place, in what we need to do, but how do we just deal with this, legacy of economic destruction and disruption in the lives, of black folk?
Yeah, this is this is all coming together. This is a great conversation. I'm really enjoying myself to some degree, and then reminded of just how intentionally bad things are. So just to put it together just a little bit, I mean, I think Tulsa represented the genius of black folk and the black idea, and when left alone, when left unbothered, right, what magic can happen. And so young people have captured this term around black magic, but it goes back into what Black Wall Street was, right? This idea of to be able to generate an idea and actualize one's goal, whether it be individual, family, or community. And I think that there's something magical that happens there. And then the hate, like the pastor was talking about, just folks hating on that magic. And we see that now in macro and micro aggressions in the workplace and in community, but it's still that seething hate, that contempt of that resilience and that genius, and to be an audience to it, a bystander to it, and not sort of having those sort of capabilities to grow as a rosewood in concrete quite often. That seething hate and the hope to activate it one day, as you saw folks storm the Capitol, incensed around the disenfranchisement of being first. And thinking that is the natural order of things. I mean, when places like Tulsa go, then you see sort of what I reference, what happened in the 1940s and the Great Migration, right? This idea of economics and zip code and poverty and zip code, and when forced out of your place of birth, when that place of birth is well stripped. Then you seek out other places. But what that does not give you is the ability to compound what Mother Fletcher was talking about, that communal wealth, right? She not only talked about having a nice house and being well off, she talked about that tight-knit fabric of community, and that sense of growth mindset and forward momentum. And so when folks have to leave the South to come up north, or to the Northwest, or renters throughout most of our major cities are pushed from one neighborhood to another, as public housing is being reduced in scatter sites for whatever, you don't have the ability to sort of build those communal wealth strategies that exist in our cultures for generations. And so when you see women and they start saving clubs and they begin to sort of actualize on owning businesses through cooperative economics, it's in our DNA. And so when you talk about that $200 million that Tulsa would have been in today's terms, what could have been done with that, if we think about repair, if we think about reparations. And certainly that could go into education. It could go into starting Black businesses. It could go into really advancing folks in the tech space, the ability to raise capital, not having that rich uncle to go and get that initial loan to start a business, that $30,000 or $45,000 to start a business, and then that additional infusion of capital to grow that business. I think you have to think about that $200 million and what it would mean for that community. You think about Black erasure and you think about Harlem and DC and Atlantic City and those beach towns where there was a Black presence in vacationing because people were doing well. And it gave people an opportunity to move outside their cities and town and connect on beaches around this country to create a greater network when we didn't have things like the internet and cell phones and FaceTime to network and connect. And so you have to think about what that means for us and our ability to be economically mobile. And then you also have to think about, like, when in a place, when you think about communal wealth, you have to think about inheritance and status and influence through relationships over a period of time. It acts just as money acts, compounded over time is what builds wealth. And so you have people who are judges and who are doctors and who are captains of industry and school board superintendents through generational maturation in a community and their power and influence holders, instead of folks who individually feel alone as systems and institutions have their will and way upon them. And so that's what we see today. And that's why we are less economically mobile than we've ever been in our country's history as a people.
Yeah. That's well said.
That's an important word in terms of community. And I want to build on that community thought. Okay. Because when we have community, and this is one of the things that I used to joke about in Chicago. And Chicago was one of the most segregated cities in the US, right? And that's because Black people had to live with Black people, and literally it was railroad tracks that separated our communities in Chicago. And I used to say, jokingly, that both drug dealers lived on the same block, right? The legal drug dealer and the illegal drug dealer. But as a result, all that money came together and you knew who to go to for what. But in addition, we got to know each other as a community, right? So that the crime, if so-and-so got into a fight, right? Or so-and-so swung on so-and-so, you can go tell their parents on them, right? Cecil took my money or whatever happened. And therefore, because we were more of a community, we knew who each other's were. The violence that is perpetuated in our community at this time was not as virulent as it is now. So that's one thing I want to say, that community, as we know each other more and build that economic base, but it also builds a base of love, right? Or a base of familiarity. And we can't underestimate that, just in terms of being able to know who we are and not face that isolation. Integration was not our friend in that regard. It just simply wasn't.
Yeah.
Then the other thing I wanted to talk about was the physical fear of what happens because we live in fear on a regular basis. And the terrorism that we live under, they talk about this whole thing, fight or flight. Mm-hmm. But what they don't talk about are those other options that we do. We can accommodate, we can negotiate, we can freeze. There are a lot of things we do, but one of the things that we all do, no matter what option that is that stress. And the stress weathers us, and it gives body to the illness and chronic illness that we suffer on a regular basis, right? Mm-hmm. So that when we have a community to go to, then it gives us a moment of release from that pressure, from that stress, where we can start rebuilding our health and well-being also. So that community allowed us that safe haven to repair, to have a moment for our bodies to begin to let that psychology of being in flight or in fear or being under threat go. So that's another big part of community. It gives us that break where we can repair our health.
Well, I mean, you said it rightly in terms of, I mean, my understanding of, the antidote to violence, or the opposite of violence, is beloved community. Around
it. There you go.
So Jan, I think you connect that for us in a very, very powerful way. I want to get to two more pieces. One is the trauma, as well as repairs or reparations. But sticking with education, it is so important that we educate ourselves. I'm glad that as a Black immigrant, I'm connected to folk that has made it their a job to educate me, around the experience of folk who look like me in this country. And I've since, taken it on myself and be intentional about that, around that. And so I think it is so essential that we do that. And that's why, as I mentioned at the beginning, Robert Lewis introducing me, to this, documentary called 7 a.m., and out of that, came, an organization called the Black Cooperative Investment Fund, that I'm glad to serve on the board for, around how to, redress that. But there's going to be several, events going on. And if you, like me, you enjoy, movies, there are two documentaries that are going to be taking place around this. That's the executive producers are professional basketball players, who have taken it upon themselves, to do their part around, redressing these challenges and addressing where we can go to. Russell Westbrook, is part of the one that's going to be airing tonight on the History Channel. We want to show you a clip. Check it out tonight on the History Channel. And then when we come back, we're going to get into trauma. Let's check out what the History Teller is going to do around Tulsa.
This wall of white people firing into homes.
Bombs dropping from the air.
It was an all-out massacre.
The story of the massacre was actively suppressed.
Tulsa Burning, tonight at 8, only on the History.
So check it out tonight on the History Channel. I hope you have it on your cable, around this. Trauma. The compounded trauma as a result of what happened 100 years ago is on the one hand compelling, on the other hand it's just so painful, around this, because what you're having here are descendants, of those who were killed in that massacre, really living side by side, not necessarily physically, but in the same city still, around descendants of those who participated in that massacre, and in so many ways, as Black folk, we've allowed, ourselves to see how we can normalize all this trauma. And part of it is because, we've been made to feel shameful about the bad that has happened to us, right? Which is a very important strategy of an abuser, right, of an oppressor, in terms of that. But on the other hand, we're also dealing with, a frozen pain or frozen trauma, which a psychologist has introduced to me, Melissa Shepard Williams, just around how do we, it's just so much to unpack. And many, many times, white folk would tell us, oh, just move on. Can we just move forward, and just kind of see where we go? And yet, so many times we know the paralysis that trauma can cause around that. So, I mean, Jan, I want to pull you in on this, in terms of just kicking us off around, just the compounding trauma that we're dealing with, not about just what happened 100 years ago, but what continues to happen. And how America seeks to capitalize in so many ways on that, such as this commission that is supposed to commemorate what's happening, run by white folk, raise $30 million. They at the table wanting to decide what's going to happen with that money. And when folk question them, they cancel their activities. Yet the folk, in Greenwood will continue with their legacy parade they had yesterday and their festival and the ongoing, work that they are doing, around what really, needs to happen. So let's kind of dig in, to that around, the reality of trauma, and then how that in so many ways gets exploited.
So this is kind of the road I was trying to go down a moment ago when I talked about we are under continuous threat, right? And that threat is absolutely traumatizing. And that's when I talked a little bit about the psychology or the physiology of that threat, the flight, the fear, the fight, the freeze, the negotiation, the accommodation, all these things that we do that then it becomes ingrained, or it becomes a part of or integrated into our physical health, right? Those, I'm gonna go back to, it is white people's job to change white people. It is our job as Black folks to work with Black folks, right? To do the love, to do the joy, to do the education, to do the acknowledgement and celebration of Black folks, right? It is our job to work with Black folks. It's their job to work with them, because I think they have a generational challenge, right? They have been these violent people for generations, and they need to speak each other's language and figure out how to get that out of their system. I think every Black person, at least every Black person in this country, has a white terror story, right? If it is, for us, I recently had my car repaired, and the mechanic, Black man, had to drive the car around. And before he drove the car around, he said, "Where's your license? Where's your insurance? Where's the title? Is everything up to date? Because I can't get stopped by the police, because a Black man getting stopped by the police is a life or death situation, right?" So I had everything there for him, right? Because I knew he had to drive the car and that he would need that. But all of us have that white terror story, and we have to figure out how to create those safe havens where we can relax, right? Where we don't have that stress. Because like you said, Black folks have a deep well of resilience and a deep well of brilliance and creativity and ingenuity. And we can figure out everything. We can make something out of nothing, right? And I am like absolutely pleased that, these brothers are making or telling our story on film and on video, because that's the new book now, right? And what the two other things, Regina King, and she did a whole series that had a basis in Tulsa in terms of telling that story.
Yes.
And then Lovecraft Country, right? Mm-hmm. They used their basis with what happened in Tulsa, right? So, and talked about the Green Book in terms of, knowing how to travel across the country. Mm-hmm. So we're using Hollywood now as a medium to begin telling our stories. And when they tell those stories, because sometimes they have drama, sometimes they are science fiction, then another part of our community, the academics, right? Those folks who have access to 1619 have to be prepared to say, here's the reality that happened from that fiction, right? Here's what it was based on. Here's some more information about this, and here's some solution based on that. So that's part of what we need to do also, just in terms of how do we begin to prepare our community to accept some of the truths, because this is, sometimes living in denial is easier than accepting the truth of the violence of this country.
Yeah, but we know that denial in so many ways is based on deception, and denial plus deception, equals destruction, and so we've got to,
absolutely. But sometimes it's survival.
Yes,
right. Yeah. Survival, because that pain is very deep.
It's very deep and very real. I know, Mitchell. I mean, when we were part of the
Dr. Sauls, before you move, can I mention something about this?
Yeah, go ahead.
The trauma. What must now become required reading for us is Joy DeGray's book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And when you want to talk about our the trauma about that face Black people, it goes all the way back to coming over on these shores. And as you know, we didn't. It was not tabula rasa like the early psychologists tried to say, that we forgot everything, but we remembered a whole lot of things. But to a degree, slavery came in, and after 40 years of that created a different being in us. And that being was dealt with there's so many vestiges of slavery that is still inculcated into us this day, in our attitudes and way we act. But on the other side of that syndrome, there are fears that we have, there's causes that we've had, and Tulsa only increases that. So we are a highly traumatized people. And what people have to understand, when we don't have, when there are two things, and was caused by white supremacy, that's the effects, and that's the effects of white supremacy in terms of what we can and cannot have or get, or how we're at times immobile, and that comes from the trauma of being in this country and all these years. It even is rooted down to, I used to be critical of Black brothers who, when they encountered the police and ran. Older gentlemen does like Sister Flint, but younger brothers, the trauma of how that is in us. All of us, when we see them, we know what they're doing. There's a trauma that comes up, and some just run. That is that escape. Let me try to escape, as we tried to escape the slave catchers, and we tried to escape that nefarious system of slavery. We are constantly in a trauma. We have to understand the trauma like you brought up in now Tulsa, and every day there's trauma that we're dealing with because of white supremacy. Until that system is negated, until there's a real form of reparations, and reparations have to come in the form of economics, education, and it has to come in a systematic mental health for trauma by Black people, as the late Dr. Bobby Wright said, that the menticide that racism has caused on us. We have to be healed, but the uniqueness, only we can heal ourselves. And that's why there has to be a part of reparations is investment, the type of money in our own educational systems, in our own educational institutions, that we can heal and educate ourselves.
Yeah, and indeed, certainly as part of that, is to see how, we are intentional around dealing with this trauma. I mean, one thing is clear, Mitch, that the institution of slavery, and the institution of incarceration, that's what it seeks. That's what it seeks to do. That's what it's accomplished in so many ways. It institutionalized us, so to think about ourselves a different way, to behave, a different way, and to basically follow a particular narrative or a script, a set, for us. That's really along the path of ongoing traumatization, around that. Mitch, you want to share any thoughts around this piece?
Yeah, sure. So immediately think about my colleague and friend at Drexel University, John Rich, who does a lot of work around toxic stress and trauma-informed care. I'm of the belief that you can't do racial equity work without doing trauma-informed work, and you certainly cannot do trauma-informed work without striving for racial equity. I think that this is this certainly comes up in conversations when I used to do men's groups, right? And the trauma in young men, and the institution is and systems are wicked, right? I mean, I think about, like, I used to ask the question as an example, like, who's really doing the time? I'm gonna bring economics into it. And so, I came into this work as a social worker. I've worked in congregate care settings, including juvenile and adult settings. And for a short stint, I did some work in placement facilities. And oftentimes, most of the employers were Black men who thought themselves to making a pretty good living by capitalizing on overtime in placement facilities. And so if you're working at a juvenile facility, you might do 60 to 80 hours in a week. You get probably 50% of your full-time pay to 80% of your full-time pay in overtime. So you had these Black guys, running around in BMWs and Audis and buying houses and dressing sharp and thinking that, with a high school diploma or more sometimes, they were making a pretty good living. But you had to ask the question, if you're spending so much time in facilities with young Black men locked up, and oftentimes are in combative relationships within your role in that institution, how do you come out of that okay? Mm-hmm. Same for police officers, et cetera. But how do you come out of that unscathed? And so there's a monetary goal and attraction to being in that institution and facility, county jails, police, et cetera. But being in that environment and coming in contact combatively with somebody who is your brother, your cousin, your uncle, your father, right? What does that do for our ability to have that communal wealth? You trade in one for the other. And so when you see somebody who looks like that in the supermarket or cutting you off in traffic, how do you then conjure up those feelings of hate or combativeness against your own because you place yourself in those environments and been a tool or an asset of the system of corruption and oppression? That's how deep it gets. And so when I see young people killing themselves in the street and they grieve by themselves without the aid or contribution or guidance of adults, that grief and that trauma goes nowhere. Now, I find myself in an interesting intersection in my life. I sit across the table quite often with people in law enforcement, trying to create interventions for communities. At the same time, I sit there knowing that I've had my own personal experience with law enforcement. I've been taken on a nickel ride as a child, handcuffed in the back of a paddy wagon as they go through bumps and bruises. I'm being tossed around in that paddy wagon as a 12 or 13-year-old, and then getting let out in a neighboring community that don't much like where I come from, 54th and whatever, and have to make my way home. And I have to put that somewhere to sit across this table from police, knowing at some point they're going to say some police stuff that's going to trigger me and take me right back there. And they black in a white shirt. But how do you choose that white shirt over your black skin? So when you talk about that othering and belonging, that desire to be accepted, in the same way when I used to work with kids in the child welfare system, you're in a foster home with a foster mother who loves you, but you sit by that phone waiting for the phone call of your mother who has never offered you anything but abuse or neglect, waiting for that moment of acceptance. This is our reality in this country.
And that's how deep that trauma goes. And there has to be a path, that leads us to repair, because brokenness does not have to be a permanent state. It does not have to be a permanent condition, right? Around that, and repair, of course, connects us with reparations, which is, just a word that America has run away from. Yet so that repair has been made with so many other people except black folk, right? I mean, at 107 years old, Mother Fletcher goes and asks for repairs. I mean, the descendants, of, Tulsa are asking for repairs. So what's that path, towards repair institutionally? Because that was state-sanctioned violence, right? City, the county of Tulsa, the state of Oklahoma. If you look at, I believe if you go into the, the library at, the University of Oklahoma there, it lists, the names of the clan, not names, first names, occupations, those who so many ways participated in what happened that day. I mean, you talk about school superintendents and teachers, and firemen, et cetera, right? I know Sheila Jackson Lee is working on this whole framework of reparation. I mean, I appreciate Ta-Nehisi Coates' perspective on all of it. But let's just touch on that. What's the path towards repair, towards reparation, as we seek to get to, racial reconciliation, in this country? I'll let Pastor Smart go first, and then Jan.
Yeah, for the pathway has to be nationally. They have to, for instance, very specifically, every business, the Business 500 needs to commit $500 million to the Black college funds for 10 years at least, to help bring up the educational standards that their racism has caused. Also, the Fortune 500 and the government too, so that these colleges are getting over to every college. So these colleges are getting over $100 million the next 10 years. Banks, every bank in America, because of redlining and everything else, and because of the destruction of Tulsa and everywhere else, banks need to give every single African American person that can pay a mortgage. Forget FICO scores and everything. If they got the money to pay for a mortgage, they ought to be granted a mortgage. Housing, education, housing. Then they need to set up, the government needs to set up a fund that can fund everybody that has had any type of trauma in their life, with not only with trades, with education, with the medicine they need, and the constant counseling by African Americans. Very sound. You're dealing with the health. Those are the areas: housing, education, mental health. If that's what they owe, that's not even a tenth of what they owe us. That's just what I feel is a start.
Right. I mean, don't forget the insurance companies, because going back to Tulsa, remember the insurance companies refuse the claims of black folk, all of a sudden, citing that, hey, that was a riot.
Every insurance company needs to put in.
So I'm amazed at how insurance companies, what role they've played, in the creating disparity and disenfranchisement.
We want some money, and we want the money to go, and we set up a national committee where we decide how that money, the programs and everything, and we don't. I mean, that's just a start for us.
Right. Jan, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm gonna agree with some, and with my caveats onto it. So I have heard, but I'm not quite sure what the story is, but I have heard that there are mass graves in Tulsa. And I have heard that, they build highways and freeways over people's homes, and, over people where they dump people. So I think that one of the things that they need to do in Tulsa, or we need to do in Tulsa, or insist upon, is that the people who were killed, murdered, slaughtered, get acknowledgement, say their name, and have their space in terms of be buried or offered rites of passage in that regard, with a spiritual connection. I think we need to create that spiritual space in Tulsa for all those people who were killed and then just dumped unceremoniously into graves, and then had the audacity to build a highway over it. Right? So I think that's one. I do think we absolutely need to talk about defunding the police and redirecting that money toward those mental, physical, financial health systems, right? And create some new systems, because the ones that we have are lacking, truly lacking. But the money that goes into policing is way, way too much. All right. So with the education, I agree that historical Black colleges need funding, but I also know that the miseducation of our people starts at a much earlier age, right? Can't wait till they get to college. We need to catch them in preschool. We need to catch them in kindergarten. We need to catch them at home with their parents. So we need to figure out that education system. And I give the example of this. I sent my daughter to a school called Uhuru Shule. And all those kids that went to Uhuru Shule, which was an independent Black school, have advanced degrees, right? So Sister Carrie, or MJ Carrie, was doing something around the expectations and the setup of those Black children at a very early age that gave them tools to negotiate all those other school systems that they dealt with. So I'm going to say the education absolutely to start preschool at the very latest.
I agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
At the very latest.
Yes,
then home security or house security is a tremendous issue, right? Because we talked about how they wanted that land in Tulsa, in Rosewood, in Philly. I'm looking at the gentrification of our community.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at houses in Los Angeles are $1 million. And that's for like 2 bedrooms and 1 bath, right? That is too much, right? And even if you can afford a mortgage, you shouldn't have to afford the kind of mortgage that is being demanded because of, the housing costs and because of gentrification and because of that push out and that movement. So I'm going to say we need to figure out housing in a different way. We need to think about reparations for folks who have been pushed out of their community in terms of how do we create those communities where our homes were, where our folks had traditionally set up, even if it's on their land, right? Meaning the land that the gentrifiers want at this point in time. And how do we create it so people feel secure in their homes? So gentrification or eminent domain or the freeway is not something that shoots you into another thing or out of your house and into that uncertainty and that state of unwell-being when you don't have housing that you are secure in. So we've got to figure out this housing issue on the real.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to health in this country, the thing that I work with is maternal and infant health on a regular and daily basis. And the anti-Black racism, the implicit bias, the misogyny, all of that. How do we retrain our healthcare workers, or how do we train our healthcare workers? Because some of those folks will not be able to be retrained. They're just going to have their bias, period. And then how do we reconfigure our healthcare system? We need a national healthcare system in this country. Our health does not need to be tied to our job. If you need some health care, you need to be able to get some health care and not worry about if your job is going to pay for it or how you're going to pay for it. Because you're right, the insurance companies have not only the property insurance companies or the business insurance companies, but the health insurance company have a reckoning that needs to happen.
Yeah.
So that health care for all needs to happen. And it needs to happen in a different way where it's not about curing you with expensive treatments that are poisonous, but about prevention, about how do you have healthy food and exercise and air to breathe and water to drink, as opposed to radiology or chemotherapy or surgery. It needs to be refocused, period. So those are some ways that we begin to configure a new system of how we deliver health around housing security and what that means for your health and well-being, around education and around policing. And then for me also, we need to acknowledge the atrocities and acknowledge our ancestors and give them that spiritual flight that they need so they can be of service to us. Because I think that's what.
Great. That's just awesome. Mitch, we're gonna let you, close us out around some thoughts, in terms of reparations.
Sure, I'll be quick. I certainly appreciate everything that's been said by the panel. So I'll try to add to what's already been said. I think one thing we have to do is we have to think differently about what reparations is, and when we're future thinking, when we're thinking about Black futurism, and what does that mean? What spaces do Black folks occupy in the future I think we then moving back from the end, sort of like we do at work. We recognize the end and then we move back from that. I think will give us different pathways of success. And so what does reparations look like? Certainly it can be in programs and interventions, but it also has to be in reform of government at the national level and policy. And so when we've seen sort of generational changing sort of anti-poverty efforts that happens between a marriage of what happens at the local level and what happens in federal policy. Think about the child tax credit right now. That's a part of the Biden's latest plan. You know, if that were to be put in place permanently, a tax credit for families permanently would be economically changing. But I also think we have to think about crypto, right? Or stock options as a part of that reparations plan. Ways in which we could sort of jumpstart how do we compound the dollar and value in which we're getting quickly, and so that money grows and we can do more with it. We don't want to be looking at a pot that then goes away after a period of time and we're sort of at a loss and at a similar place in a not so distant future. And so we have to think about that. We have to think about sort of philanthropy and pharmaceuticals as well as insurance companies, right? The philanthropies quite often hold a lot of dollars and have an archaic view of the world and how interventions are made and take that decision making from them and those dollars from them and fit them more appropriately. We have to think about pharmaceuticals as an example of being responsible for the opioid crisis. What is their payment to our communities, our Black and Brown communities, and then how can we be a part of growth strategies in sectors which we know are going to grow or going to be around for a long time. So I think that those are some of the things that we have to do if we're thinking about reparations. And I also think I love the idea around making peace with our ancestors. And so similarly in Philadelphia around MOVE, there were mishandling of human remains here locally by Penn Museum and our own health department. And how do we hold both spaces around acknowledging the good of institutions, but also acknowledging when mistakes happen and harm happen, and how do we repair beyond that? And then spaces like tech and certainly legalization of drugs. What is our place in that, and what's our dollar value? And also the last thing I'll say is information. Mm-hmm. There is no more information on any group of people than our folks because we're looked at as consumers. Right. And so there are a lot of algorithms and AI just built on our information, who we are, where we are, what we do, what we like, the choices that we make. Monetize that. Put a dollar value on that. If you want our information, here's what you pay for. Right. Those are the type of things that we have to be thinking about, having conversations and putting on our agendas to push forward.
All right. Wow. This has been just fascinating, and we ain't through yet. I'm going to ask Felicia to get the flyers ready. We want to display about what's coming up the next couple of days here in Los Angeles that the broad collaborative of folk put together with SCLC. There's the first one that shows us around, what's coming up. Tomorrow through I think it's Wednesday or so. So as Felicia put that flyer up, if you'll see that in Lamert Park tomorrow, there will be an event, a festival around Black Wall Street. Tuesday, there's another event that's taking place. So just check it out. It's going to go through. Saturday, I believe, around that. Pastor Smart, you want to just say a few words about, what's coming up?
Yes, on Monday. Thank you, Pastor Sauls. On Monday, we're going to at 2:00 at Lamert Park. We're going to have just a a program to recognize that. That's the first day of that the commemoration. We're going to have a program at 2:00 at the corner of 43rd Place and Degman, and then Tuesday, the realtors we're going to be giving out food, because one of the things is we have to sustain our people. And I'm proud to be, Pastor Sauls is involved in the distribution of food, and I'm glad to be part of one of the largest collaborations of giving out distribution of food in the city. And so the realtors are doing that. And then that night at 7:00, we're going to have a Zoom program about the massacre, Black Wall Street. And then on Saturday, we're focusing in on our own Black Wall Street. The Lamert Park vendors are going to, and we're going to be encouraging people to build our own community, shop at the Lamert Park Village merchants on Saturday. And we'll be giving out food again, giving out shoes, and giving out other things, but the vendors will be taking off 10% of whatever you buy. We need to build up our own communities in the face of this. And so I really wish that would get out, and we're going to really be pumping that up all week too, that Saturday is our day to show that we can change the channel in the direction that things are going. Thank you for this opportunity, Pastor Sauls.
Thanks so much. Let me share, this closing words, and we're gonna, end with, promoting the Dreamland documentary. It's gonna come up on CNN tomorrow night, and I want to end with that, because the director of that documentary, that is, executive, producer is LeBron James. When she was asked about, why it was called Dreamland, because she said that, so many ways, a lot of Black folk felt shame about what happened, on those 2 days, 100 years ago. That's the narrative that's been, created, and that it was, that they were to blame, for that, and that's kind of the narrative that's happening in, this country, and in other spots, where racial inequity continues, around that. But she said we wanted to call it Dreamland because what we, see that happened in, that Greenwood neighborhood was about Black brilliance. It was about Black resilience, right? She goes on to say that, part of it is, we ought to just celebrate Black creativity and Black ingenuity. And all of that, unfortunately, causes a lot of, fear, right, with white folk, and creates a lot of hatred with white folk. Not because we are the issue, right? Because, when you are what God has intended for you to be, you see, and somebody else got issues with that, you ought not to dim your light to make those who feel insecure or fearful of your brilliance and your resilience and your ingenuity, right, and your dignity and your humanity. They're going to have to deal, with that. White folk don't have to determine when we are enough. You are enough because you've been beautifully created, in your mother's womb. And that is so important as we deal with the trauma, around this. We will, later on in future podcasts, just look at this whole piece of what role, faith played in this, and the role that white mainline Protestant congregations played in their silence and their justification in so many ways around the atrocities, of Black folk. That's why, we're talking about, religious nationalism, right? Because there is a theology of white supremacy. It's not just an ideology, but know that you are enough. And because you are enough, we can develop and create, the communities once again, such as Dreamland, and do it in such a way that it facilitates equity and equality, for all. That's what Beloved Community is all about. I want to thank Mitch Little for joining us from Philadelphia, Jan for joining us right here from Los Angeles, and Pastor Smart. Thank you for who you are and what you do, and looking forward to our ongoing, work towards facilitating Beloved Community. This has been Faith Without Borders. We have discussed the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of Black Wall Street, or the Tulsa Black Massacre. And I hope that it's been enlightening for all of us and empowering for us as we continue to move forward towards a more just and fair society. Thanks so much. Keep the faith.